The morning Cecily walked into the drawing room of Ashford Park, she wore a gown borrowed from the vicar's wife and shoes that had belonged to a woman 3 years dead. The shoes fit badly. That struck her, afterward, as the one honest thing about the entire occasion. The room was full. Lord Ashworth had arranged it so, guiding the morning with the careful hand of a man who understands that certain reckonings require an audience to be complete. 30 people at minimum, seated or standing along the walls, angled toward the fireplace where the mantelpiece held a portrait Cecily had never seen before, a woman rendered in pale oils, dark-eyed, pearl-collared, serene in the permanent way that oil and canvas permits and living women rarely achieve. Below the portrait sat a small engraved card in a silver frame. In loving memory. And then a name. Her name. Cecily Vane. Beloved wife of Edmund Lord Ashford. Gone from us in the autumn of her 22nd year. She stood in the doorway for a count of 3, long enough to see Edmund across the room, long enough to see the color leave his face entirely, long enough to watch a glass slip from his fingers and shatter against the marble hearthstone without him noticing the sound. She said very quietly, precisely what she had traveled 4 days to say. He staggered. She had not permitted herself to imagine that part. There are debts the world renders quietly, and debts it renders in front of witnesses. Cecily had spent 3 years learning which kind was which, and she had calculated, with more patience than she had known she possessed, that this particular reckoning required both the fireplace and the 30 people arranged before it. If you have stayed to hear this story, you already understand what it cost her to wait. The difficulty with being buried is that the ground holds a different story than the one told above it. Cecily Ashford, born Vane, had married Edmund at 19 in the small parish church of Wexbury in the first cold week of November. She had not been a celebrated bride. Her father was a clergyman of modest living, her only portion a small sum left by a grandmother who had been careful rather than wealthy, and the match had struck the county as improbable, the sort of marriage that raised eyebrows in drawing rooms for a season and was then filed away under the heading of inexplicable decisions made by young men with more feeling than sense. Edmund had been 26. He had inherited the Ashford estate at 18, and the estate had come with Lady Ashford, his mother, who had been managing the household for 8 years before Cecily arrived, and saw no particular reason to revise that arrangement. Lady Ashford was not a cruel woman in the theatrical sense. She was a woman whose sense of the world's proper order had calcified slowly over 40 years until it had the quality of stone, and the idea that a clergyman's daughter had any business ordering the Ashford kitchens was precisely as plausible to her as the idea that the kitchen cat might one day inherit the estate. Cecily had managed. She was not a woman given to grievance. She had come to Ashford Park in good faith, in love with her husband, in the uncomplicated way of 19-year-olds who believe that love is itself a structural element, load-bearing, capable of holding everything arranged on top of it. She had been wrong about that. She had been wrong about several things. The marriage had been, for its first year, something she might have called content. Edmund was not unkind. He was absent, frequently. On business he did not explain, and when he was present he was pleasant in the way of men who have learned that pleasantness costs nothing and commits them to nothing. He had a quality of fundamental remoteness that she had first read as restraint, and then, as months accumulated, as something closer to indifference. He looked at her the way one looks at furniture one has not chosen, but has decided to tolerate. Lady Ashford, for her part, looked at Cecily the way one looks at a stain on good upholstery. Persistent, faintly incomprehensible. The first season of the marriage had included precisely the kind of dinner parties at which a new mistress of Ashford Park might have expected to be welcomed, and at each of them, Lady Ashford had arranged the seating so that Cecily occupied a position adjacent to the conversation, rather than within it, close enough to observe, far enough that her contributions required an effort of attention no one in the room was particularly moved to make. The assessment of Cecily's place at Ashford had been delivered that first autumn at a dinner attended by most of the county's relevant people. Lady Ashford had made the observation to Mrs. Pemberton of Greenley House, with the smooth assurance of a woman who knows she will not be contradicted, that dear Edmund had always been susceptible to a pretty face and a helpless situation, but that the girl would settle into her proper sphere in time, which was to say a sphere somewhat below the one she currently occupied. A vicar's daughter was a vicar's daughter. There was no amount of Ashford silver that would change the fact of the bone beneath. Mrs. Pemberton had nodded, and the shape of Cecily's social position had been established in the space of that single evening. She had survived it. She had survived the second autumn, too, and the third would have come had events not intervened. In the spring of her third year at Ashford, Cecily had fallen ill. Not gravely, not theatrically, but genuinely, in the low and grinding way of a fever that refuses to resolve, that keeps a woman in her room for 2 weeks, that makes the light painful and the sound of footsteps in the corridor unbearable. She had not seen Edmund during those 2 weeks. He had sent, twice, his compliments and his hope for her swift recovery, delivered by the housekeeper, Mrs. Dallow, who had been the only person to sit with Cecily during the worst nights, and who had done so with the quiet competence of a woman who considers her job to encompass whatever needs doing. Mrs. Dallow was 60 then, with knees that had been troubling her for years, and a face that gave nothing away unless she chose to give it. She had served the Ashford household for 22 years. She had helped lay out the body of Edmund's father, and had managed the household through the first 2 years of Edmund's inheritance, without ever once suggesting that a young man of 18 had any business making decisions about linen cupboards. She had watched Cecily arrive at 19, and had, in her methodical way, decided how she felt about her within the first week, and had not revised the decision since. The decision was, in brief, this. The girl was honest, and she was trying. Those were, in Mrs. Dallow's estimation, the 2 most necessary qualities in a woman who had undertaken to be the mistress of a household that did not want her, and they were the 2 qualities that no amount of training could supply if the nature was not there to begin with. Mrs. Dallow had seen women arrive at great houses with better portions, better connections, better dresses, and none of that honesty, and she had watched every one of them either harden into something resembling Lady Ashford or quietly disappear. She had not wanted either outcome for Cecily, and the fever had frightened her in ways she had not acknowledged to anyone, and Edmund's departure had clarified her feelings on the subject in terms she found impossible to misread. On the 14th day of the fever, Cecily had been well enough to take a little broth and to hear, through the window, the sound of carriage wheels on the gravel below. She had not thought much of it. Carriages arrived at Ashford, but the carriage had taken Edmund away, and 2 days later, while Cecily was still confined to her room, Mrs. Dallow had knocked very carefully on her door and had stood in the doorway with an expression Cecily could not immediately categorize, in which grief and something that was not quite relief were very carefully balanced against each other, and had told her what had happened. Edmund had married again. In London. A Miss Sophia Barnett, daughter of a baronet, connection of the Forsley family, an arrangement that Lady Ashford had been promoting since the previous Christmas. The marriage had been performed quietly, without announcement, and was being represented to the county as having taken place subsequent to Cecily's death. Cecily had listened to this without speaking. Mrs. Dallow had waited. After a long moment, Cecily had said, very carefully, that he could not do this. Mrs. Dallow had said, with equal care, that he had done it. This was the truth the portrait in the drawing room had been commissioned to support. The small engraved card, the pearl-collared serenity. A woman of 22, gone in the autumn, who had left no inconvenient living evidence of herself because she was presumed to be confined to her sick room, or recovered and quietly departed, or any of the several other explanations that could be given to a small county by a man of Edmund's confidence and his mother's social authority. If you are wondering why no one checked, you understand something about what social authority means. If you are wondering how Cecily escaped the sick room, you must understand that Mrs. Dallow had a sister in Wexbury, and that Cecily's father was a clergyman who kept his parish records with the kind of precision that God and the bishop required, and that a marriage cannot be unmade by pretending the wife is dead if the wife's baptismal record and the marriage register both tell a different and more durable story. The 3 years had not been pleasant. She had lived in Wexbury with her father, in the reduced quiet that a woman in her situation could expect. She had taught the parish children their letters. She had copied documents for her father's correspondence. She had read every book in his small library 3 times and had borrowed from the lending library in the market town on Tuesdays when the weather permitted. And she had spent the evenings in the particular way that people spend evenings when they are thinking very hard about a problem they cannot yet solve, which is to say she had appeared to be doing nothing in particular, while in fact being almost entirely occupied. She had written, twice, to a solicitor in London, whose name she had found in her father's papers, and whose brief replies had informed her, in measured terms, that her situation was legally clear but practically difficult, that Edmund's position in the county gave him advantages that a clergyman's daughter would find difficult to overcome, and that the most useful evidence she could produce was witness testimony from someone present at the original marriage and willing to stand before the relevant authority and say so. The parish children had been, in their way, a comfort. Not because teaching letters and sums was the life she had imagined, but because it required her to be present in a way that grief does not permit and planning does not require. Present in the specific demanding way of a child who has not yet grasped that the letter B and the letter D face different directions, who needs the correction given a 4th time with the same warmth as the first. Cecily found she was good at this. She found that the patience she had been developing across 3 years of waiting was a transferable quality, that the discipline of not saying the thing she most wanted to say had made her remarkably good at saying the exact thing someone else most needed to hear. This struck her, on occasion, as one of the more ironic lessons that her circumstances had arranged to teach her. She had spent 2 years finding that person, or rather 1 year finding the person and 1 year ensuring the person was willing, and the distinction between those 2 activities was the distinction between locating a resource and building the kind of trust that makes a resource into an ally. Mrs. Dallow had resigned her position at Ashford Park in the spring of Cecily's 2nd year of exile, citing age and the desire for a quieter life. She had moved to Wexbury. This was not a coincidence. It was the kind of deliberate action that a woman of 63 takes when she has decided that her employer has forfeited whatever claim her service gave him, and that the record should, in time, be corrected. The letter Cecily had written to Lord Ashworth of Threlwick Cross had been the 3rd document she had composed on the subject, and the only one she had sent. Lord Ashworth was Edmund's cousin, 12 years his senior, a man who had been at Ashford Park for the original wedding, who was known for the kind of integrity that made men uncomfortable at dinner and respected in every other circumstance, and who had been, in the 3 years of Cecily's absence, increasingly cool toward Edmund in ways that Edmund had apparently not connected to anything specific. Lord Ashworth had received the letter on a Tuesday. He had replied on Wednesday. His reply had been 4 lines. He would be at Ashford Park the following Friday. He would bring his solicitor. He trusted that Mrs. Dallow was well, that the letter had arrived at all, that Lord Ashworth had answered at all, that Mrs. Dallow was indeed well and willing to travel despite the state of her knees. These were not accidents. They were the accumulated result of 3 years of quiet and extremely careful preparation by a woman who had decided that the ground that claimed to hold her was going to be required to give her back. The morning she walked into the drawing room, Cecily had been standing in the garden for 30 minutes before anyone saw her. Lord Ashworth had arrived the day before, under the guise of a family visit. He had arranged for the drawing room to be occupied at 11 o'clock, with as many witnesses as he could reasonably gather without explaining why, citing only that he had something important to discuss with Edmund and that he preferred it not to be private. Lady Ashford had arranged the witnesses with the confidence of a woman who manages social occasions without needing to understand them, assuming that whatever Ashworth wished to discuss was simply another variation of the family business that men discussed in drawing rooms, while women arranged themselves around the edges and provided a decorative audience. She had not anticipated that the decorative audience would include the portrait. The portrait had been Lady Ashford's addition, not Edmund's. It had been commissioned 18 months earlier, after the season in which Miss Sophia Barnett had become Lady Ashford, and the original Lady Ashford had repositioned herself as the Dowager with the smoothness of a woman who has been waiting for precisely this transition since the marriage was arranged. The portrait gave the new arrangement a narrative. It gave Edmund's household a coherent history. A first wife, mourned, laid to rest, properly grieved and properly superseded. The pearl collar was a particular detail that had pleased Lady Ashford. Cecily had never owned a pearl collar. The imagined version of her was better dressed than the original. Cecily had looked at the portrait for a long time when Lord Ashworth showed it to her the evening before. She had not felt the emotion she expected to feel. She had felt something colder and more clarifying, the kind of feeling that comes when you have suspected the shape of a thing for years and then finally see it rendered in oil paint, actual and specific and framed in gilt. She had slept that night. This had surprised her. The morning of the drawing room, she had dressed carefully in what she had. The gown borrowed from Mrs. Anstey, the vicar's wife, was a pale gray wool. Good quality, plain. She had arranged her hair herself. She had put on her gloves. She had told Lord Ashworth that she did not need him to walk beside her, that she would enter the room on her own, and he had looked at her with the expression of a man who knows that the particular quiet of a determined woman is not something that benefits from argument, and he had said only that they would be directly behind her. She had walked in on her own. Edmund had gone so pale that the firelight looked orange against him. He said her name, not loudly. He said it the way a man says a word that he has spent 3 years telling himself he will never need to say again, and then find sitting in his mouth before his mind can prevent it. Then the glass fell. Then Cecily said what she had come to say. Lady Ashford's fan stilled. Sophia, the second Lady Ashford, young and fair and entirely innocent of what the morning had been arranged to reveal, made a small, confused sound. The room did what rooms do when something unprecedented occurs. It drew itself very still, the way water goes glassy before a stone strikes it. Cecily did not look at Sophia. That was not cruelty. It was precision. Sophia's situation was its own problem and would require its own attention. And there was nothing Cecily could do about it by looking at her, and there was a great deal that could be undone by looking away from Edmund at this particular moment. Lord Ashworth entered behind her. His solicitor, Mr. Greaves, followed with a case of documents. Mrs. Dallow came last, walking with the slight heaviness of a woman whose knees have not approved the journey, but whose face approves the occasion entirely. Edmund said, his voice lowered nearly to nothing, that she was dead. Cecily said she was not, in fact. The second Lady Ashford sat down. This was not a voluntary action. She sat the way a woman sits when the floor has shifted, and the chair is simply the nearest available surface. Lord Ashworth did not speak yet. He allowed the room a full 30 seconds of silence, which was the most deliberate thing Cecily had ever watched a man do. 30 seconds in which Edmund could not pretend he had misunderstood, in which Lady Ashford could not interrupt with a reframing, in which the witnesses could do nothing but absorb what they were seeing. The label Lady Ashford had applied to Cecily across 3 years of county dinners, the provincial girl, the clergyman's daughter who had somehow managed to catch Edmund in a moment of sentiment, had been voiced a second time in this very room, 6 months earlier, to a caller who had asked carefully whether the late Lady Ashford had been well regarded. Lady Ashford had answered with a smile of perfect social precision that the girl had been sweet-natured enough, if not precisely what one would have hoped for, and that Edmund had been young, and these things happened to young men, and that the present arrangement was naturally a much better fit in every respect. 3 people in the room this morning had been present for that conversation. They were, Cecily noted, now looking at Lady Ashford with expressions she found instructive. A third voicing had come only 2 weeks before Cecily's return, in a letter from the Dowager to a cousin that the cousin had shared with Mrs. Dallow's sister, who had brought it to Wexbury folded small inside her glove. The letter had called Cecily a difficulty that Providence had very obligingly resolved, and expressed the confident hope that no further inconvenience would arise. Mrs. Dallow had kept the letter. Mr. Greaves now had it in the document case. Lord Ashworth spoke. He spoke with the precision of a man who has been planning his sentences for several days and has chosen them the way one chooses tools for a delicate and irreversible operation. He addressed Edmund directly. He named the date of the original marriage. He named the parish. He named the witnesses, including himself. He stated the matter of the second marriage with perfect flatness, neither excusing it nor elaborating on it, simply placing the fact in the room where everyone could examine it. He said that Mr. Greaves had brought the relevant documents. He said that the Lady Ashford, born Cecily Vane, was alive and present, and her legal standing was not in question. Then he said, his voice the same level and unhurried it had been throughout, that the question remaining was what Edmund intended to do about it. Edmund said nothing. He had the look of a man standing inside a catastrophe he has spent 3 years trying to prevent, and who finds, now that it has arrived, that he does not have a single appropriate thing to say. His mouth opened, his mouth closed. He was not a man without intelligence. He was a man whose intelligence had been entirely devoted, for 3 years, to a project that was now not merely failed, but publicly failed, in front of his mother and his second wife, and 30 people who had driven out from the county for a morning call, and would be discussing this at dinner parties for the next decade. Lady Ashford was the one who spoke first, which was unsurprising. 8 years of managing things had given her reflexes that operated somewhat ahead of her judgment, and she said, with a composure Cecily found almost admirable, that there had clearly been a misunderstanding. Mr. Greaves opened his document case. What followed was not dramatic in the theatrical sense. It was, rather, procedural in the way that genuine reversals tend to be, less a climax than a series of unavoidable small collapses. The parish register, the marriage record, Mrs. Dallow's testimony, delivered in the flat-measured tones of a woman who has decided that accuracy is the only charity she owes. The letter from Lady Ashford's cousin, read once by Mr. Greaves in a voice entirely devoid of editorial comment, which was itself a kind of editorial comment. Each document passed from Mr. Greaves to Lord Ashworth to Edmund with the patient ceremony of things that have been waiting for years to be placed in their correct order. Lady Ashford's composure did not shatter. It did not fragment in the way of theatrical villains. It went quiet instead, in the way of a structure that has lost its load-bearing element. Not collapsed, but no longer standing for the purpose it was built to serve. She looked once at Cecily. Her expression was difficult to name. Recognition was part of it. So was something that might have been, if not remorse, then at least the adult understanding that a thing had been done, that could not be undone, and that there was no further value in denying its having been done. She sat very straight. She said nothing further. Edmund spoke, finally, when Mr. Greaves had finished with the documents. He spoke to Cecily directly, which took a form of courage she had not necessarily expected from him, and he said he was sorry. Not in the theatrical sense. Not with the embellishments of a man performing contrition for an audience. He said it plainly, 2 words, and looked at her while he said them, and then looked away, because there was nothing else in his face that the occasion permitted him to show. Cecily did not tell him that it was all right. It was not all right, and would not be all right on the evidence of 2 words, however plainly said. She said she knew. Lord Ashworth made the practical arrangements with the efficiency of a man who has handled complicated family situations for 20 years, and long since stopped requiring that people feel the appropriate emotions before the paperwork was completed. Sophia was attended to by her own people, who had arrived by early afternoon, having been sent for by Lord Ashworth's messenger, at the moment the room had reached its conclusion. Sophia was young and gentle and entirely blameless, and the manner in which she left Ashford Park was conducted with the kind of quiet procedural decency that allows people to recover without further wound. Cecily felt toward Sophia a grief that had nothing to do with rivalry. The portrait came down from the mantelpiece that afternoon. The silver frame with its engraved card was removed by a footman at Lord Ashworth's request, and not replaced. The nail hole in the plaster above the fireplace remained for several weeks before anyone saw to it, and Cecily found, during those weeks, that she did not mind looking at the bare wall. It was more honest than the portrait had been. The county had its dinner parties. The county always has its dinner parties. What was said in them Cecily knew only in fragments, through Mrs. Dallow's careful summaries and the occasional unguarded comment of a caller who came to Ashford Park in the weeks that followed and had not yet recalibrated their understanding of who held what position there. The county's opinion of Edmund had diminished in ways he would be managing for years. The county's opinion of Lady Ashford had done something more complicated, the kind of revision that people make when they discover that a person whose authority they have trusted was deploying that authority in service of a particular story, and that the story was false. Lady Ashford did not leave Ashford Park. Cecily had not asked her to. What would be the point, at 64, of displacing a woman from the house she had managed for 30 years on the grounds that the managing had been done badly? The point was not displacement. The point was correction. Lady Ashford understood this, or came to understand it in the weeks that followed, and the shape of their household arrangement settled into the quality of a renegotiated contract between 2 people who are clear-eyed about what each owes the other and have concluded that practical coexistence is more sensible than continued conflict. This was not warmth. It was not forgiveness. It was the specific adult arrangement of women who have each other's measure and have decided that the measure is workable. The question of Edmund took longer. Lord Ashworth handled the legal dimensions with Mr. Greaves, and the legal dimensions were, in the end, less complicated than Cecily had feared, and more so than Edmund had hoped. His situation was not recoverable in any of the ways he would have preferred, but it was manageable in the ways that mattered most practically, which was to say that the Ashford estate remained, and the entail held, and the title held, and what Edmund lost was not the estate, but the comfortable pretense that his life could be arranged to exclude whatever elements of it had become inconvenient. He came to Cecily in the library in the third week after the drawing room. He came in the evening, when the fire had burned down to something quiet, and she was reading a book she had borrowed from the Ashford shelves on the first morning she had felt entitled to borrow anything. He stood in the doorway for a moment, before she acknowledged him, and she let him stand there, because she was not yet in the habit of making things easy for Edmund, and was not sure she would ever be entirely in that habit. She put the book down. She looked at him. He said, his voice level, that he wished to speak to her honestly. She said that would be a change. He sat. He looked at his hands for a moment in the way of a man who is deciding how much of the truth he can afford to say, and then he looked at her as though he has concluded that all of it is the only defensible quantity. He was 34 years old, and he looked it in the way that men look their age when the pretense they have been maintaining falls away. He was not unkind, essentially. He was a man who had made a decision that had seemed, at the time, very clean and manageable, and who had spent 3 years inside the consequences of it, and discovered that decisions of that kind are rarely either clean or manageable. They are simply deferred. He said he had not believed she would survive the fever. She said she had. He said he had known, before he left for London. He had known she had recovered. He had gone anyway. Cecily had known this. She had known it for 2 years, assembled from small evidences, Mrs. Dallow's careful silences, a letter she had found misfiled in her father's papers, the timing of certain things. Knowing it and hearing it stated aloud were different things, and the difference sat in her chest for a moment before she absorbed it. She asked why he was telling her this. He said she deserved the accurate account. She thought about this for a long time. The fire settled. Outside the library windows the November dark was complete, and the grounds were invisible, and the sound of the evening was nothing but the occasional shift of coal in the grate. She asked what he wanted from her. He said he did not know. He thought he wanted to be in the same room with her, without the story between them. That was perhaps too much to ask. It was not nothing. It was also not very much. Cecily considered it the way she had been considering difficult problems for 3 years, which was to say carefully and without the luxury of certainty. She said he might sit. He might not speak unless he had something honest to say. He sat. He said nothing. They read in the same room for the better part of an hour, and the fire burned down, and the candles guttered, and neither of them spoke. Cecily was aware of him, the way one is aware of weather through a window, a presence that changes the quality of the air without requiring acknowledgement. She did not look at him. He did not, so far as she could tell, look at her. And this was, Cecily concluded, a beginning of some kind. Not an ending. Not a resolution in the clean theatrical sense, the particular, strange, specific work of 2 people discovering whether anything honest can be built on the foundation of what had been, and it was slow, and it was not comfortable, and it was not the story that the portrait had told. The portrait had been burned. She had asked for that specifically. The frame could go to the estate inventory, the card disposed of, but the canvas she had wanted burned, and Mrs. Dallow had seen to it on a gray morning in November. And Cecily had not watched, because she did not need to watch. She needed only to know. There was no other painting of her. She had thought about this. She decided she did not mind. She had no need to see herself rendered in pearl and calm. She knew what she looked like. She knew what she had endured. She knew which story was true. Lord Ashworth came to dinner in December. He came alone, having sent his solicitor ahead with the final documents in the settlement of various matters. He sat at the Ashford dining table, where he had sat 31 times before, where he had once sat at Cecily's wedding dinner, and where he sat now, with the ease of a man comfortable in exactly the degree to which a situation has been made right. Over the soup, he looked at Cecily across the table and said, very quietly, as though the rest of the table were not present, that she had managed the business more neatly than he had dared hope. She said Mrs. Dallow had managed most of it. He said Mrs. Dallow would tell him the same thing about Cecily. Edmund across the table did not speak. He ate his soup. His expression was difficult to read. Cecily had been studying it in the weeks since the library, and she thought she was beginning to understand it. It was the expression of a man learning, late and at some cost, the difference between management and truth, and finding the lesson slower and harder than any lesson he had previously been required to take. She was not sure what she felt about Edmund. She had expected, across 3 years, to feel a clean and useful anger, the kind that organizes itself into purpose and burns steadily, and she had felt that for the first 2 years. The 3rd year had been quieter, not forgiveness, something more complicated than forgiveness, and probably more honest. She thought she might not know for some time. She thought that was probably accurate, and probably, in the long run, the only position worth holding. In the evenings, in the weeks that followed December's dinner, she sometimes found Edmund in the library. He did not come every evening. He did not present himself as reformed, which would have been insupportable, or repentant in the theatrical sense, which would have been worse. He came in the way that people come to rooms where they have begun to understand something about themselves, without ceremony, without declaration, and sat, and sometimes they spoke about the estate accounts, or the parish, or the particular difficulty of the west wall, which had been damp since October and would require attention in the spring, and sometimes they did not speak at all. In the 2nd week of December, Edmund had said, with the careful diction of a man choosing words that will not retreat once spoken, that he would like, if she was willing, to begin again in some form that she found tolerable. He had not specified what beginning again might mean. He had not made it into something larger than he was sure of. He had offered the specific limited thing he felt he could honestly offer, which was his presence and his willingness to be corrected, and the general direction, if not the guarantee, of his better intentions. Cecily had said she would think about it. She had thought about it for 2 weeks, which was the correct amount of time for a proposition of that nature. At the end of 2 weeks, she had told him that she was willing to see what could be made of the material available, which was not poetic and was not romantic in any of the senses that the novels in the Ashford Library promised, and which Edmund had received with an expression in which relief was visible, and something that looked, cautiously, like the beginning of something warmer than relief. They did not declare themselves. She was not sure they ever would. She thought that was probably all right. There were things in the world that did not require declaration to be real, that accumulated instead through the patience of mornings shared and evenings in the same room, and the slow building of a vocabulary of honesty that neither of them had previously spoken with much fluency, and perhaps this was what became, in time, of a marriage that had been made wrong and was now being remade, quietly and without ceremony, into something that had at least the virtue of being true. By Christmas, the library had become hers in the way that a room becomes a person's when they have spent enough evenings in it, that the chair holds the specific shape of their reading. She had rearranged the shelves. Lady Ashford had noted this without comment, and the absence of comment was itself, from Lady Ashford, a form of acknowledgement that required no further translation. Mrs. Dallow had stayed. This was the thing Cecily would carry forward, not the portrait burning, not the documents, not Edmund's 2 words in the drawing room, or his honest account in the library, not the county's revised opinion, or Lord Ashworth's careful arrangements. Mrs. Dallow had resigned a position and moved to Wexbury and kept a letter inside her glove for the better part of a year, and then she had walked on her difficult knees into a drawing room at 11 o'clock on a Friday morning because she had decided that a thing had been done incorrectly, and she was one of the people who could say so. That was the kind of loyalty that a woman could not plan for and could not manufacture and could not repay in any ordinary sense. It simply was, the way some things simply are, and the only adequate response to it was to be worth it. On Christmas Eve, Cecily gave Mrs. Dallow a pair of wool stockings, which was not a grand gesture. Mrs. Dallow received them with the expression of a woman who has been given the practical thing she actually needed, rather than a sentimental thing that would require dusting. Mrs. Dallow said she had done well. Cecily said they had. Outside the window, the first snow of the winter was coming down over the Ashford grounds, soft and unhurried, covering the gravel and the boxwood hedges and the stone walls and the garden where the portrait had been burned, covering all of it alike, with the impartiality that December has always had toward the stories that land tells about itself. The candle on the sill burned in the draught. The flame leaned, but it did not go out. Cecily stood at the window for a moment, watching the snow come down over the dark grounds, watching the white fill in the shapes of things she was beginning to know as hers, the turn in the wall, the gate to the kitchen garden, the pale stone of the path. She was alive, in her own drawing room, in shoes that no longer fit quite so badly now that she had worn them long enough. She was alive under her own conditions, and not someone else's, and the ground had given her back. If her story moved you, leave a note in the comments and let us know which moment stayed with you. The candle burned on.